I want to talk about the Democratic Party from more of a structural perspective and how, at least in my opinion, if it doesn't radically and relatively quickly kind of recalibrate what the dominant factions and interests are within it and its current trajectory, how in its current iteration it is not anywhere close to being a feasible vehicle for addressing the ever-mounting crisi that we are facing. Let's go with crisi. And so just for the purposes of this video, I'll do a very brief, abridged version of the history of the Democratic Party, which is potentially inaccurate, but I think is mostly correct, just so that people know how we got to where we are today, because you can't solve anything if you don't know what it is that led to this current moment. And so essentially, like, take from the end of the Civil War up through the 1890s or so, Democrats were extremely racist, extremely pro-business, almost had no redeeming characteristics. It started to change in the 1890s. People might have heard of the populist movement or the People's Party, which was kind of a collective of regular people trying to reform the Democratic Party. Or initially, it was like a third-party movement, but then in 1892 and then again in 1896, they supported William Jennings Bryan, who was an insurgent Democrat who actually beat his own incumbent president in the 1892 Democratic Convention, and like rose within this corrupt party to try to offer some reforms, including getting off the gold standard and other populist measures that would have been good for the people, but he still had a very racist coalition therein, but it was a very racist country, and so in that way it was representative of the dominant factions within society up to that point. Kind of got rolled back in the 1920s, but then in the 1930s, people know FDR got elected after the Great Depression, and he actually kind of took it to his own class of people, which were kind of the capitalist ruling class, which he came from, and implemented a number of reforms and brought unions to the table and made it more of a labor working class party. And by this point, but it still had like a very kind of racist coalition of Dixiecrats and a lot of anti-Semites, and people might know that he like turned back like a giant ship filled with Jewish refugees from Europe because there was a lot of anti-Semites in his party at the time, as there were a lot of anti-Semites in the country, as there were a lot of racists in the country, and a lot of them in the Democratic Party too. But it did usher in the New Deal era, which I'd say continued through like the 1960s for sure, and then it got changed for the better again with Johnson, who all these Democrats are very pro-war. I'd say that especially Truman, Johnson, Roosevelt not so much, but kind of the military-industrial complex just rules everything all the time, and that was the history of the Democratic Party and still is today. But the things that have changed are, back then it was, as I said, a labor party, and then it also got changed away from being kind of a racist party. And so Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then the South flipped. The South was voting Democrat essentially up until that point, and then soon thereafter with Nixon, the Republicans started running the Southern strategy and started doing more dog whistly type languages because they saw an opening after the Democrats had re-enfranchised the African American vote, which a lot of racists down there that were part of that party before didn't like, and so it kind of flipped on a dime. But then the Democrats got the black vote, and so which actually started back in the New Deal era, also specifically in the 1932 election. After some of the first reforms of the New Deal, black people started voting more for the Democrats, even though they were the party of the slaveholders before, and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln. And so essentially, kind of like the Democratic Party, in my view, kind of peaked in like the 1960s and 1970s, like with Johnson, in that it still had a lot of the labor-based, like actual democratic accountability and union support and so on and so forth of like the people that were, kind of what rebuilt it in the 1930s and also to a degree in the 1890s. But it wasn't super racist anymore, and so that was good. It was still kind of a bloodthirsty arm of the military-industrial complex, but that's more of a ubiquitous characteristic of American political culture, and something that both parties have always kind of been doing, at least since the end of World War II and the rise of the permanent national security state and the military-industrial complex. But unfortunately, that kind of started to get rolled back as the Republicans and the business community started to fight back, and more and more money started going to the Republicans, and Reagan blew out Carter in the 1880s, and globalization started to take over, and there was just kind of the labor movement and the militancy of the 1960s and 1970s kind of started to dissipate, and people started to be more kind of distracted by commodification and trying to get theirs. And so the Republicans started shellacking the Democrats, in part because they were taking over the racist vote in the South. And so the Democrats lost, and they lost, and they lost. 1980, 1984, 1988. They were probably going to lose again in 1992, but then Bill Clinton is like, hey, I have an idea of how we can beat the Republicans. I can become a Republican and do everything the Republicans do and still somehow hold on like to the remnants of kind of the popular labor-based coalitions of regular workers, which was our current base, because they're not going to vote for the Republicans because they're totally off the spectrum. And then also I can court Wall Street, and I can court big donors just like the Republicans, and so in that way I can beat them at their own game while holding on to our past coalition and thereby win the election. Well, he did that in 1992, and then he went on to pay back those new special interests that had a higher role within the Democratic Party by passing NAFTA, by deregulating Wall Street, and repealing Glass-Steagall, and ushering in welfare reform. These are all things that were on the Republican agenda, but the Republicans couldn't get through. But when the Democrats take on that agenda themselves, then the opposition is gone. And so essentially, and then that continued up through, I'd say from 1992 to 2008, people were pretty unhappy. Things were starting to go bad back then. A lot of people didn't like the current system. And so what the Democrats did is they rebranded someone named Barack Obama, and he seemed very different, and he was a black man, he spoke charismatically, and he talked about hope and change. But if you listen closely, it was kind of empty and vapid, and if you looked where he got his money, it was from the same exact places. And so then these same labor-based coalitions and progressive organizations and liberal institutions that the Democrats have been holding on to this whole time got behind Obama because they thought, because he was the only game in town, and also a lot of them, including the voters that were supportive of those organizations, thought he was going to bring about change. It didn't really happen that way, and then also Wall Street supported him because they knew he wasn't, because they're a little smarter than we are. And so essentially nothing changed for 8 years under Obama other than people's apathy for the political process and their cynicism for the entire system, as the person that they hoped would change things instead went on to codify kind of the national security regime of the Bush administration and the war on terror, and then adopt the framework of the budget-cutting Republicans who wanted to take an axe to the social safety net rather than expand it, which to a degree he ran on, but like I said, mostly it was vapid. And so nothing really changed, and people got more cynical, and then eventually Trump was elected, and during that time the Democrats consolidated their support of kind of liberal intelligentsia and the coastal elites and became more and more of a suburban upper middle class or upper class or extremely wealthy party of people that have made it, and much less so a party of the working class. They're union based, which was their bread and butter once, but is now less and less so. So that essentially brings us to today, where in 2020 the Democrats got more money from special interests than did the Republicans, and that's for almost every special interest. And that's not to say the Republicans didn't get a lot of money, but they gave the Democrats more, with the exception of the fossil fuel industry gives more to the Republicans, and I know the casino industry gave more to them, but essentially all the special interests, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, go down the line, gave more to the Democrats. And from a certain perspective that's good in terms of money wins elections to the tune of over 90% of congressional races. The winner just has more money because you can just flood the airwaves with misleading information and dogpile on your opponent with one thing that he said and run it 1,000 times, and then you win the election. And so that's great. The Democrats won the election. They got more money. The bad news is that if it was a party of the working class and just regular people, the thing about those special interests is the reason that they're giving to that party is because the thing that they're supportive of are not democratic. As in, most people don't want those things. If the people wanted those things and they wanted those things, they would pass. But they don't want those things because if they, let's say if the pharmaceutical industry had significant pricing reforms and they weren't allowed to, mess with our prescription drugs to the point where we can't re-import drugs which are manufactured here from Canada, and they have essentially a monopoly and they can set any price they want because there's no regulation. If it was, if the democratic will was enacted in that circumstance, then they would lose all their money. And so what they say is, we'd rather keep all of our money and use a small percentage of it to give to the Democratic Party, and then we can co-opt all their politicians. And then every other special interest essentially does the same thing. And then what you get at the end of the day is all these working people who are also consumers are now within the same coalition as the corporations, which are price gouging them in the form of pharmaceuticals, but exporting their jobs overseas and for the manufacturing industry, and doing a number of other things which are bad for the people, as people know, living their lives in America, but good for those corporations. And the remedy for that, or the historical remedy for that, which was the Democratic Party, which was never perfect but did enact some reforms in the past, is now part of that coalition. And so where's the remedy? The only other option these working class people might see is the Republican Party. And the thing about the Republican Party is that they're even worse, and they don't even pretend to be in support of the things that would actually be the solutions. And so the Democrats will say, like, oh yeah, like, we need to reduce income inequality and stop these pharmaceutical companies from price gouging, and help the working man. They'll say like they are supportive of the solutions and then never pass any of them. And the Republicans won't even pretend to support the solutions, but will instead find other scapegoats, things like xenophobia and demagoguery, and they'll be like, look, it's the government's fault. And insofar as the government hasn't really done anything good for 40 years, they have a point to the regular working person that might hear that. And they're like, yeah, the government, does suck. I support the Republicans because they don't support the government. Well, if the Democrats, which are, for better or worse, kind of like the government party, which the government at its best is supposed to be, democratic representatives of the people enacting the things that they want instituted into their lives. If it's that, and the Democrats are the Republican Party, they might blow out the election after election after election after election after election after election, as Roosevelt and Truman did for, I think, 6 straight elections. Or if they're the government party and the government sucks and is corrupt, and then they'll lose over and over again, which they won this last election, but overall it hasn't been going that well. And even when they do win, they don't implement any solutions, which is why, bringing back to my original point, the Democrats, in my view, in their current iteration, are not a feasible vector for solving the problems of the 21st century. And another little wrinkle is, as the Democrats enact almost no reforms and coddle the special interests, they need to have things to run on as well, so they lean more and more heavily into the culture war as well, and into like kind of identity politics, which is especially ironic because, as I said, it's becoming a whiter party and a richer party. So you have like the paradox of like wealthy, privileged white people in the cities like becoming more woke and like concerned about racial disparities while supporting the policies and having no class-based analysis, when disproportionately the impacts and the brunt of the burden of all of these terrible reforms that the Democrats have been co-opted into subverting for the last 40 years impact the working class, which is disproportionately the people of color. But that's not on the agenda, because doing class-based issues could like increase their taxes. So instead, like, we'll focus on just obscure, marginalizing, very kind of, technocratic and unpopular, like college sociology major type, language policing. People know what I'm talking about. Things that have almost no impact. And it doesn't even appeal to the traditional constituency of the Democratic Party or the people that it's supposed to be helping, i.e. black people, Hispanics, minorities by and large, in that they're moving to the Republican Party, as are the working class people. So unless the Democrats can get back to being a party that actually kind of offers solutions to the mass of people which have real problems, workers and people at home that can't afford to have kids, and people that don't have health care, and people know there's lots of problems, there's no solutions being offered. There's woke scolding, there's increasing cultural virtue signaling, and there's a leaning into issues that actually offer essentially no benefits to these people, and that are actually, if you look at the polling, unpopular, extremely unpopular in some cases, even with minorities. If you actually go down the line of what the kind of liberal orthodoxy kind of Twitter lingo is when you talk to real people, it's not popular at all. And the Democrats are adopting it while offering no solutions. When these other issues, things like making it so that prescription drug prices can't, or prescription drug companies can't price gouge people, it has like support in the 90th percentile, and the Democrats control the government at all three, no, two of the three branches, but the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they don't have, it's not on the agenda. And because of that, people distrust the government more. The Democrats are the government party, the Republicans are the anti-government party and the scapegoating party. And that means that the working class people, which should be in alignment with the historic Democratic Party, or at least the best elements of it, are now moving in that direction, which is a very, very dangerous trajectory for the country. And it's not going to change. Pelosi's not going to change it. Schumer's not going to change it. Biden's not going to change it. Obama's not going to change it. Only thing that could change it is the things that changed it in the past. In the case of the 1890s, it was like working class farmers and people banding together and starting their own Farmers Alliance and then political party in the Midwest, and essentially just doing the democratic grassroots organizing. Same thing in the 1930s with the labor organizing of the CIO and militant like sit-down strikes. And then in the 1960s, it was the civil rights movement. It's regular people coming together and then making them change. And right now it looks pretty bleak, but unless that change happens, I don't see what the outlet for the potential solutions being implemented could be. So